Welcome, everybody. This is Bob Hollis with Mobius Intelligent Systems with a couple of quick pointers to make your experience more pleasant today. One is if you seem to have lost your GoToWebinar panel, click the little orange button with the white arrow, and that will extend it back out so that you can see your control options. Everybody is muted by default due to the number of attendees and prevent background noise. However, we really encourage questions. So as a question comes to mind, please enter it in the question box and submit it. And we'll get to a few of those throughout the webinar, but most of them will be held to the end where we'll have plenty of time to answer any remaining questions. And with that, we'll pass it to Heidi.
Thanks so much, Bob. I'm Heidi Sanborn. I'm the Executive Director of the National Stewardship Action Council. And I want to thank Bob Hollis with the Mobius Network because he always hosts our webinars for us and is a great ally in this war against waste, as is our friend Jim Puckett here today. And that's why we're here, is Jim's going to give us a great presentation on what's going on with the Basel Convention, the impacts on the US, and what we all need to know. So just a little background on who is the National Stewardship Action Council. We advocate for a circular economy. We are all about action. We're a 501c4, meaning we can do lobbying in other states. And our mission is to collaborate if we can to make these changes, but if legislation is necessary, we are absolutely able and willing to do that. Next slide, please. So our board is made up of a broad group of people that are consultants, work in government, waste haulers, legal eagles in the industry like Constance with, and she works a lot for Swana and even the World Bank. Next slide, please. And we have diversity also of not only a career, but also from around the country and also from different demographic groups. And we're very proud of that. We've got Maya from the Hilliard Foundation and Jordan, Estate Recycling, Texas Alliance for Recycling. Bob is a consultant in Ohio, but he actually used to be a founding director of our board and California Product Stewardship Council, and now is the president of the National Recycling Coalition. And then Beverly Handstrom with Colorado Medical Waste. Next slide, please. And our last board members, or some of our newest board members, we're very proud of, again, the great group of people we put together from government, from consulting, and business. And so we're just very excited about our team. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna just start with this and let Jim take it from here. But what is a circular economy? A lot of people throw the terms around, but what is it? According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, it is a multifaceted approach where producers embrace sustainable design, using regenerative materials and collecting end-of-life products and materials for continuous use in the economy. And it is based on three things. And a lot of people only talk about the first one, which is designing out waste and pollution. The second one is to keep the materials in use. But this is my favorite. We have to stop being less bad and actually be good by regenerating natural systems. And what Jim's going to talk about today is just how horribly bad we're being when it comes to plastic pollution in the environment and what is our responsibility to change it, because we can't fix it until we stop adding to it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim and just say that I've known Jim, I think, over 10 years. I hadn't been in touch with him until recently, but actually, no, that's right. You had spoken to our California Commission on Recycling Markets and Curbside Recycling, and I was so excited to hear what you're working on. We record the webinars, but I really wanted to share your knowledge with the entire country and make sure everybody heard it. So that's why we decided to hold this webinar. Plus, it's very timely because the Basel Convention goes into effect on plastics January 1st of this next year. So if you want more information about the Recycling Commission, what we're doing, go there. But with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Jim because he's the star of the show. Thanks so much, Jim, for joining us.
Thank you, Heidi. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to be talking today about the Basel Convention, which usually doesn't concern folks in the US that much, but I'm going to make the case that it's a big concern and it's imminent. So first thing I want to tell you about is just a little bit of the basics of what the Basel Convention is, what it does. That's important. It's a treaty. So conventions are treaties, and this is under the auspices of the United Nations Environment Program. It's one of the most successful treaties in having saturation of a lot of countries. Almost every country is part of it, and it's the world's only waste treaty. And the Basel Action Network is the only really dedicated NGO focused on the Basel Convention and its issue of waste trade, primary issue. And that's how we came out with our name, Basel Action Network, as well as the acronym about banning this type of dirty trade. So what does it do? It has two aspects to it, like most conventions. It has what we call soft law. These are general obligations. Nobody's going to get arrested for these things. But the soft law aspects call for national self-sufficiency in waste management. That means every country should take care of its own waste. And it calls for minimizing all forms of transboundary movement of wastes and other wastes. It calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous and other wastes. And it calls for ensuring environmentally sound management of that which is produced as waste. And then there's the hard law aspects, which is the real nitty-gritty, and people can certainly be prosecuted for violating these things in those countries that are parties to this convention. So first off, the hard law defines what hazardous waste is and what other waste is. Other waste in the convention is actually a term. It really is defined in an annex. And so those annexes are annexes 1, 3, and 8, which is where it describes what a hazardous waste is. The other way something can be a hazardous waste is according to national law. So if a country, any country, say China, that's a party, says we think this is a hazardous waste, then all the other Basel parties have to respect that. There's a sovereign right to create your own hazardous waste definitions and forbid imports of that material or put controls on it. The other big category is called other waste, and that's Annex II, and it's described as waste for special consideration. So they're not hazardous per se or not non-hazardous per se. And right now, there's a listing that says that waste collected from households is a other waste, which will be controlled, but is not necessarily hazardous, and incinerator ashes from the burning of those wastes, household wastes. And this new category, which is largely what I'm going to be talking about today, which just is going to be coming into the convention on January 1, certain plastic wastes are listed there now on Annex 2, and I will describe what those are. So the other part of the hard law is the control procedures. There's two ways of controlling the trade in hazardous and other wastes. The default norm of control is what's known as notification and consent, or prior informed consent, PIC. And that basically says you have to, if you want to send hazardous waste or other waste to another country that's a party to the convention, you have to notify them before you send it, get their consent, and then it can go. Without that procedure taking place, it's illegal traffic and it's a criminal act. And then there's another type of control, of course, and that's a prohibition. A full prohibition, no prior informed consent. You can't do it. And I told you that countries can have prohibitions on a national basis, and that's absolutely true. They have that sovereign right. There is a ban on export to Antarctica that's in the convention. And really important for this discussion, there's a ban on trade between the parties to the convention and the non-parties, unless you have a special type of agreement called an Article 11 agreement. And this is important because the US is not a party. So that means usually countries can't trade with the US of controlled wastes if they're a party and the US is not. Trade can't take place between the two. And then there's a new ban, which is I'm not going to be speaking about today too much unless people want to ask questions about it at the end. And that's the Basel Ban Amendment, which is now in force as a new Article 4A. It basically says you cannot export hazardous waste to developing countries from developed countries for any reason. So looking at the map of the world here, we see a glaring issue. We see that non-party countries are almost invisible, except for one very large developed country, which is not a party. So there are 187 country members out of 193 member states of the UN. The only UN countries that are not parties to date are East Timor, Grenada, Haiti, San Marino, South Sudan, and the US. What's wrong with this picture? It's really a shocking situation where the US is really a renegade in the global governance of waste trade. So in the beginning, the convention was designed to deal with factory waste, waste coming out of corporations, but more and more the waste that is problematic, that is traded across borders, is post-consumer waste, our waste. And that is borne out with the EWaste trade, mostly going from developed countries to Africa and Asia. It's borne out with ships, old vessels for shipbreaking in South Asia. Most of our ships today are broken up on beaches that are full of toxicity and asbestos and etc. in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, and the plastic waste trade. And most of that, as we will discuss, is going now to Southeast Asia. So the plastic amendments, they happened back in May of 2019. And the reason they happened, basically, were twofold, and that is that the Chinese, as you're quite aware, created the policy of national sword, and that was into effect in early 2018. And they basically said, we are not going to be the dumping ground of the world anymore for scrap. And that move was dramatic. Earlier than that, they were receiving the lion's share, absolutely, from the United States. About 3/4 of the waste, plastic, for example, generated in the United States was going straight to China. This is a picture from a film that was very demonstrative and effective, made by a Chinese national who is from the villages one of the villages that was receiving all of this plastic waste. There were numerous villages. And the film Plastic China was shown once in China and then immediately banned, and 2 weeks later the national sword policy came down. But the film was pretty devastating. It really looked at the human aspects, the human impacts of these villagers, dealing with all of the Western world's plastic waste and the contamination of the residues and the exposure. So if you can look at this chart, it's pretty dramatic from one year to the next. On the left, we see 2017. On the right, we see 2018. And these columns you can see on the right-hand side is the importing countries. And you can see on the left-hand side in 2017, most of the waste was going to China and Hong Kong, which is part of China. And then after the national sword policy went into effect, the waste was really scattered widely, but most of it was going to Southeast Asia, where Chinese businessmen simply went there and set up shop in places like Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So we really had a situation of chaos, which we're still in right now, where people are scrambling. Brokers are trying to find countries that are willing to take the waste, trying to find facilities. So after this Chinese ban went into effect, the exodus has primarily been to Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, the facilities are absolutely substandard. So much of the waste that comes in on the bales is mixed polymers, and only a fraction of it can be sorted out and recycled, and the rest of it is dumped in the area and burned. And most of these facilities are in agricultural areas in the countryside of countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. So we had that situation, and at the same time we had increased awareness by policymakers and the public about the severity of marine pollution by plastics. And this became to such a level of concern that the two issues together combined to create a need to really do something about the problem. People were becoming aware that indeed fish were going to become less voluminous than the plastic waste in the oceans, and they had an impact on the life in the oceans. And so those two issues made people think, what are we going to do about this? What can we do quickly? And the Basel Convention was already there as an existing treaty. an existing convention. It could be used immediately. Whereas there's a lot of talk about making a plastics treaty and having it be full life cycle. This one could be harnessed immediately. And so Norway took up the cudgel and said, we are going to do something using the Basel Convention to control the out of control trade in plastic waste. The conference took place in Geneva in May of 2019. And there were more than 180 parties there. Most parties were absolutely in support of the Norwegian agreement. Norway was very smart. They got the EU to agree. They got Japan to agree to it, which is very unusual for this type of control procedure. Japan would jump and take a strong stand. Canada as well. And China wanted the most radical position of all. They said they wanted all plastic waste to be controlled, not just a certain amount of them. The NGOs were there in great force, hundreds of them, and here we're producing a petition which ended up being more than 1 million people supporting the Norwegian amendment. And here we're presenting it to the parties. The opponents were very few, but very powerful. So we had the American Chemistry Council, CFIC, ISRI, URIC, all these business associations not happy at all with these new trade controls. And the United States was probably the only major country that was having real problems with it. And of course, the United States not being a party, they couldn't really vote against it. So they used Argentina and Brazil, which are parties, to voice their concerns. But it was really a very minority view that was opposed to the idea. The US does stand alone, pushing back against controls on plastic waste trade. Unfortunately, they're the only OECD country that feels that way. Everyone else is getting on board and realizing we indeed need to control these out of control plastic wastes. So what is the intention of these amendments? It is to ensure control and transparency for their movement, for the movements of those wastes which are not likely to be recycled mechanically or in a proper way. And so basically the categories that they described, and I'll go a little deeper on this, as plastic waste mixtures. So the only mixture you're going to be allowed to have in the future is a mixture of PET, PE, and PP. They don't want any more contaminated plastic waste, so no extraneous non-recyclable materials. They have to be pretty clean, and how clean is clean will be discussed. And then the halogenated polymers like PVC are also to be controlled. And the control that they want to use is prior informed consent. So they want to put most of these plastics on the Annex II other wastes. And that will require notification by the exporting state and consent of the importing state. And assurances of environmentally sound management come with that. You cannot send something to a facility that's not environmentally sound management. You have to have some proof of that. And failure to do that equates to illegal traffic and, again, a criminal act. So that's the intent of these new controls. So before they came into place, just to give you an idea of how radical this is for the world and its trade in plastic scrap, no country really that I was aware of controlled plastic waste trade. No specific listings were on the hazardous waste list for plastics. Some plastic waste was listed as non-hazardous, but nobody ever referred to that. And certainly there were no plastics on Annex II unless it was part of the waste collected from households category, which is unmixed garbage. I mean mixed garbage that's unsorted. Now, after January 2021, coming very soon, we're going to have a new plastic listing for hazardous waste. The impact of that is going to be small. There's not that many things that are considered hazardous plastics as yet. Annex 9 is going to have a strengthened listing, more specificity. But the big one is that anything that's not on Annex 8, hazardous, or Annex 9, non-hazardous, will fall automatically into Annex 2, which will require controls. At a minimum, the control will be prior informed consent. But as I'm going to describe to you, this is going to be a ban for the United States for a large part of it. So before I get into that aspect, let's dig a little deeper onto the exemptions from the controls. So these are the 4 categories which you can trade freely without controls. And that would be, and they have to be going to mechanical recycling, not to incineration. And these would be plastic waste, almost exclusively consisting of one non-halogenated polymer, so no PVC. So you could have one set of polymers like ABS all baled together, one polymer, that would be okay, as long as it's clean. And the plastic waste has to almost exclusively consist of one cured resin or condensation product. That's another category. So an example there is urea formaldehyde, but it has to be a whole bale of nothing but urea formaldehyde or epoxy resins, for example. You can't have it mixed because mixed stuff is very difficult to recycle. And the third category is plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one of a short list of fluorinated polymer waste. So this is a set list, it's not open-ended. For example, PFA, you would need to have a whole shipment of that and nothing extraneous, no other polymers. And then finally, I mentioned this mixture of polyethylene, polypropylene, and polyethylene terephthalate. They can be mixed together, and as long as they are destined for separate recycling at the end point and are free from contamination, that's the only mixture that will be allowed going forward. This is dramatically different from what's happening now. The municipalities the MRFs are collecting this waste and they're baling up the plastics that are all mixed together. So that's the norm. That's what's been going to China and then to Southeast Asia more recently. So this is a dramatic departure from what we have been doing and what we are doing today. So anything other than those 4 controlled categories going from mechanical recycling must either be controlled as a hazardous plastic waste, and that will be rare, or waste for special consideration, and this will be very common. So the question you might be asking, what is meant by contaminated? So this is something that was left to later interpretation. Wasn't decided at the meeting in May of 2019. The amendments use the terms almost free from contamination and other types of waste. It's very strong legal language. It signifies de minimis, almost free from. And they cite, though, a footnote, and they say, in this respect, international and national specifications may offer a point of reference. However, that was thrown in. I think it's not really to point. Respects, for example, institution of scrap recycling industries are not created for environmental reasons. They're created for commercial reasons. And there really are no specifications that really look at the environmental considerations and the recyclability considerations. So most countries have said those respects are not going to help. And there aren't many other specifications that people have cited. Now, already Hong Kong has set the contamination level for this purpose at 0.5%. And that's the level of extraneous material allowable. It's pretty strict compared to what's the norm now. Indonesia has said 0 contamination. NGOs like BAN are saying 0.5% if it's non-hazardous. So if it's hazardous, clearly it's going to be considered as hazardous waste. Positions are being developed right now. In fact, yesterday I finally got the EU draft guidelines, and the EU now is saying they're proposing 2% of extraneous material would be the cutoff. And likely this will be decided by the most influential countries. So by all intents and purposes, I would think China and Hong Kong's view will be very influential, as will the EU. The EU one is not decided as yet. The Hong Kong one is. So I mentioned that this new category of controlled waste will be defaulting to prior informed consent. However, the United States not being a party to the convention, it's not going to be prior informed consent. That trade will be illegal traffic due to the party to non-party ban, unless there's a special Article 11 agreement drawn up between the countries. For example, if the US really wanted to keep sending things to Malaysia, they'd have to have a special legally binding accord between Malaysia and the US to allow that. Otherwise, it's a complete no-go. Now, the US not being a party, they're not going to prosecute exporters, but once that waste gets out on the high seas, it's illegal traffic, and certainly the importers will be prosecuted because they are Basel parties and have implemented the Basel Convention in their national law. So what really happens here is the legality of trade for these Annex II plastics, which are where most of the plastics we're trading right now is going to fall. These are for other countries, not the US. So from a Basel party to another Basel party, yes, they can do it, but they're going to have to do it with PIC, prior informed consent. And then in the OECD group, they have a special agreement, except for the US. Going to the OECD, except for the US, yes, you can do it, but with Basel PIC. And the reason I say except for the US is quite complicated, but the US challenged the OECD not to accept these new amendments. And so the OECD didn't. And now the OECD parties are not going to have plastic in their remit for trade. So the US kind of shot themselves in the foot. So now the only way the US is going to trade with other OECD countries is by bilateral agreements that they can forge. So looking at the US situation, so the US export, if the US wanted to go to other OECD, again, no, like I just mentioned, unless you have a bilateral agreement like with Canada. They've just completed an agreement with Canada. They just informed me yesterday. But the US being a non-party, they cannot send things to other non-parties. That should be a no there. I'm sorry, it says yes, but that's an absolute no. Only Timor and Grenada and Haiti. Oh, I'm sorry. Confused myself. So the US sending to non-Basel parties, it is a yes, but that's a very unlikely situation. These are the only countries that fall in that category. But the normal situation is the red here. The US sending to other Basel parties that are not in the OECD, no, they cannot do it. So what that means is these countries, for example, and others that are Basel parties, cannot accept mixed and dirty Annex II plastics from the US starting in 2021. And this is where it's all going, folks. So here are some graphs of what's happening today, this year. You can see the plastic waste exports flowing out of the US and the different polymer types, which are going to be covered if they are contaminated or dirty or mixed. Here you can see the flows all together going to non-OECD countries. So you can see the OECD in green and the non-OECD. So you can see that there's a tremendous amount of material that will be illegal as of January 1, which is creating a serious anxious situation because that's coming in just weeks. Here's where a lot of it is going. You can see the different destinations. High exports continue to Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. We'll make these slides available so people can study them. And the various states involved, California leads the way in the exports that are taking place. Texas, Illinois, Georgia follow close by. But most of the United States are involved in this trade. California ports are sending quite a lot of it because they have the western seaboard ports. So very soon, we have the Basel amendments going into force for all the countries of the world except for the United States, virtually. What are the United States, the states within the United States, going to do to avoid becoming complicit actors in and infamous for illegal trafficking in this waste? We can foresee that there's going to be a tremendous amount of media attention on this. Certainly the NGOs are going to be pointing out the illegal exports. And again, they're not illegal from the US, but as soon as they're on the high seas, boom, they're illegal traffic. Interpol is alerted. The importing countries could be prosecuted. Our trading partners could go to jail. for doing this? What can we do about it? So I'm going to end with some policies that we can discuss at the state, local level. Given the fact the United States is not a Basel party, what can we do to avoid this chaos? First, it's important to note that the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution forbids a state from banning trade. They're not supposed to have any purview over trade. However, given that restriction, we can do a lot. A state can adopt a policy of not allowing exports that will violate the laws of importing countries. And that's just from a pragmatic standpoint. Why would you allow exports that are going to come flying back after they've been seized? They will be returned to the ports of export by countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. So it's a very pragmatic thing that you could argue in court. A state can also set the non-hazardous contamination level allowed and keep it at 0.5%, for example, to be consistent with what Hong Kong is going to be saying, and probably a lot of the other Southeast Asian countries. We could also demand full transparency. So in lieu of a ban, it's very important that people know what's going on. We at BAN have always declared that the public has the right to know where their waste goes. It's their waste, and they basically hire municipalities who then hire haulers to deal with it. But it is their problem. It's a ratepayer issue, it's a taxpayer issue, and the public has the right to know where their waste goes. And that means absolutely that they should see the very facilities where it ends up if they want to. A state can legislate that all municipalities, haulers report on export volumes, destinations, and demonstrate legality in the country of import. So they can say, we want to see that this is a legal import with that material that's going to Malaysia. We know what the facility looks like. We then can go there and really study it and see if it's environmentally sound. We can verify that transparency by using GPS tracking and spot audits. GPS tracking is something BAN is very much involved with electronic waste, and we're gearing up to do that with plastic waste. A state can make sure no recycling diversion credits are given for export because proper recycling is extremely unlikely, so you shouldn't be getting those credits. And we should have strict penalties for violators, obviously. So to find those new amendments, I didn't want to bore you with the fine text, but if you really want to find them, they're on our website, and this is the quick link to that particular page. But on our website, you can find them in the library if you dig down in there and look into plastic amendments if you want to study the actual amendments themselves. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and attention. And hopefully, Heidi, hopefully we have some questions.
Yeah, I have, looks like I don't see any questions in the chat now. But I'll give people time to put it in there in the question box.
Heidi, I have a couple that came through back channels.
Oh, okay. Is this the one, are the Basel Party countries considering expanding the list of materials beyond plastic and hazardous waste?
It's always a possibility, and it's a likely possibility. One of the issues that has not been touched upon, remember I said that plastics are not usually considered hazardous waste right now, but we have introduced the fact and put studies on the table that show that indeed they are. So what's not been looked at with respect to plastics is all of the additives that go into these polymers. So a lot of times the additives actually outweigh the polymer itself, and we can have cases where lead and cadmium, for example, are extremely high in concentration in these plastic marketed mixtures. And so it's very complicated to regulate that, but in fact it needs to be because these additives have just been forgotten. And most plastics, almost all plastics, when they're marketed have additives, and many of those are hazardous. So we can see the future that hazardous plastics will become a lot broader list.
I suspect that's the case too. And in fact, to me, plastics are hazardous because we've already documented they're in our food chain and we don't know what health impacts they have. I used to think that on EPR, we passed the first ordinance on EPR in the country in Alameda on medicines. And the court said that it didn't violate the Commerce Clause because it was a hazard product. Now, I have always said that, you know, or first early on, I thought, well, that means that counties can't do EPR for packaging. I now think differently. I think we've got enough science now that we could actually prove the hazardousness of waste plastics and litter breaking down into our food chain, into our soils and water, et cetera. So maybe that's turning. Let's see, there's another question. What would it take to get the US to join the Basel Party agreement? Are there groups working on that right now?
Well, it's a really good question. We've had this question for years and years and years, but I actually am optimistic now. We had, with these plastics amendments, they've gotten a lot of attention and people have woken up. What's this Basel Convention? Why are we not party to it? In fact, Senator Lindsey Graham the other day in a hearing about marine plastics said that very thing. He said, what's this Basel Convention? Why aren't we part of it? And I have gotten phone calls from many senators' aides saying, what is holding things up? Can't we do this? We have a new administration, obviously, and in the past, we've been disappointed in both Democratic and Republican administrations about their paying attention to the Basel Convention and the Basel ban, for example. But now the ban amendment is part of the convention. It used to be a very controversial thing. Now it's part of it. Plastics is at the forefront. I think there might be a new impetus to join the rest of the world, and not only on Basel, but there are other treaties that deal with chemicals, such as the Stockholm Convention or the Rotterdam Convention, which the US is just negligent and not being part of those. And there have wide saturation, like Basel, of countries all over the world being part of these rules, but the US has been outside those rules. So it doesn't help to be outside the rulemaking and outside of global governance. And I won't hold my breath because I've been holding it for almost 30 years, but who knows? It could happen. Certainly, we have raised this issue and we're looking at ways to talk to the transition team about this.
Yeah, well, there may be people on the webinar listening here that might be able to help with that as well. So hopefully,
that would be terrific.
Yeah. Another question for you. Have any US legislators in the Senate or the House backed joining the Basel Party agreement?
Yeah, there are a lot of senators that would love to see this happen. We're going to need to have probably a new bunch in the Senate to make things move, because the Senate is where treaties start. There was given advice and consent way back in the Papa Bush days for ratifying the Basel Convention, but now the Basel Convention has changed. There's this new Article 4A, which is the Basel Ban Amendment, is now part of the convention. So I think legally they'd have to get a new advice and consent from the Senate. So the question is, will the Senate let that happen? So that would be the starting point.
Okay, I'm having a really hard time, Bob, seeing these questions. They're itty bitty and I'm trying to pop them out, but I can't seem to do it. So maybe you could read them off because I can't see them in the question box. They're too small.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Heidi. Thank you. 1 second, I'm getting my box up in here. Okay, do you have those plastic test reports available for review?
Test reports?
Yes, I'm not sure which reports they're referring to. That's what the question reads.
Maybe they're referring to the additive studies. There's quite a few of those. We haven't done testing ourselves. We're relying on scientific studies that look at the additives and realize that they're extremely hazardous. You know, brominated flame retardants are examples, phthalates are examples, PFAS materials are examples. There's so many additives that have been ignored. And I'm with Heidi. I think most plastics are very well could be considered hazardous waste. The reason Norway didn't do that is they said we need controls without getting into a long, prolonged debate about whether they're hazardous or not. Let's just call them waste for special consideration and move forward that way.
Great. And another person requested the link. If there's a way we can copy and paste that into the chat, we can send it to everyone. But also to the person who asked that question, we will be providing a copy of the video and slides to all attendees. So you'll be able to get it from the slide. And,
and we have it posted on our website as well to make it easy, because if you go to the Basel Commission website, it's hard to find.
thank you. And we can send that link out as well.
You can go back to that slide so they can be looking at it while we're talking too.
Okay.
I can see them now, Bob. I was able to figure out how to pop them out.
Okay.
Okay, so the other one is, so what does the ban mean for liquid or aqueous waste, for instance, waste engine oil?
So that's not normally going to be considered a plastic, but waste engine oil is considered a hazardous waste under the Basel Convention in most instances. So those are already covered. That would not be new. And again, the U.S. not being a party, they shouldn't be sending things that are hazardous or other wastes to non-parties. They should not be doing that. It's illegal. Not illegal for Americans to do it, unfortunately, but it's legal as soon as it's on the high seas, and it's illegal for the importing countries to import it.
Just amazing we've gotten so far out of the loop on and stuff like this as a country. It's very disappointing. I really hope folks on the call can help us get that changed and get us back into the convention. Do you have, so we asked about the plastic test, who is responsible for enforcement and when does compliance go into effect? I would think compliance is January 1st. The question is who's going to enforce that?
Yeah, so international law, as you probably realize, doesn't have its own international police force. It's enforced by the member states. So countries like Malaysia, which are receiving so much of this plastic right now today from the US, which should be illegal as January 1. It's up to them, their customs officials, their environmental border controllers to implement the import ban, the import controls. And if they're seeing something coming across their ports, which has not been notified to them, or is coming from the United States and therefore is illegal because the US is a non-party, they are obliged to seize that shipment. And depending on the country, what type of penalties they will impose, whether they will prosecute the importer or just send it back, that really is variable depending on the country. As a minimum, most often they seize the shipment. Lots of costs are incurred, demurrage charges with the container sitting there doing nothing for probably weeks. And then they put it back on the ship and send it back, and they send a bill for the demurrage charges, etc. So it can be really messy. And this is going to become widespread if we don't do something about it. If the states don't say, we want to find a way to prevent this and start to comply, even at a state level, with these new international norms.
But the easiest thing would be if the US just rejoins, right? Wouldn't that be the fastest way to?
Then the US can prosecute the illegal exports, which is the most efficient thing.
So really, that's where I think we should all be pushing to see if we can get some national movement. Because I know the new administration is looking at very quickly undoing a whole lot of stuff that's been done. And this is like Paris, we're removing ourselves from Paris. So this to me falls in the same category. How do we get somebody at the national level to include adding us back into the Basel Convention as part of that, adding us back into Paris Agreement?
Yeah, we've been holding up from these multilateral environmental agreements for so long, and there's just a backlog of them. We should just ratify them all. Because the US sends people to all these meetings, it's not going to change the budget. They just don't have any say in them. And the rest of the world is leaving us behind. It's really creating a problem. Here we have the world's most wasteful country per capita not being part of the world's only waste treaty. So it's a big problem.
Doesn't look good. Okay, so can't the executive branch make the decision to join a convention as the US joined the Minamata Convention on Mercury, become a party, a signatory, and then ratify?
Well, you know, that's interesting. They're not supposed to. If you read the Constitution, you're supposed to have advice and consent of the Senate. I'm still trying to figure out how they did that with Minamata, which is the Mercury control treaty. It's the only one they ratified. How that was agreed to by the Senate without any fanfare, it had to have happened. And whether the Senate signed off on it or voted on it, I've still not gone through the history to figure out how that happened. But no, you cannot do it just from the executive. Some countries can, but in our Constitution, it's very clear the Senate has to give advice and consent.
Can states join? Can we, because I think in California, we basically said we're still in, even though our country is out of Paris. Can a state join?
Well, again, because it's a trade agreement, it's going to run afoul of the Commerce Clause. If you've got some states that can counter that with some kind of legal argumentation, I've provided a few ideas. Heidi, you said that there's precedent in California for having states make bans on certain things with respect to the EPR law because it was hazardous. But the convention, you'll definitely have people taking you to court. ISRI is going to take anybody to court that tries to ban trade from a state level. So you have to have really good arguments. And I think the argumentation that if you're violating other countries' laws, it's like common sense, no brainer. This is going to cause your state all kinds of problems because the waste is going to come back. You're going to have to deal with the charges, the lawsuits, etc. It's going to come flowing back into the U.S. ports as contraband. It's a mess. So I think the state could argue very strongly about that.
Okay. What are the implications for e-waste polymers containing flame retardants or covered as mixed polymers or hazardous products?
Yeah, so with e-waste, I've been working on that for many years, and we have our own association of responsible recyclers called e-stewards, a certified group that refuse to export their waste in contravention to the Basel Convention. So now the e-stewards, for example, have already adopted these agreements. They are already not sending this mixed computer plastic to developing countries. And so all of the computer recyclers are going to have to be very cognizant of this, because computer plastics are many different types of polymers, and they have just been smashing them all together and baling them up. And this is not going to be exportable anymore. So this is a huge issue for them. And they're scrambling right now. I haven't got a really good answer to you about how they're resolving the problem, because everybody, once they find a way they think they've got it resolved, they don't want to tell anybody else about it. But we're going to be doing a webinar on this in the future for the electronics industry and electronics recycling industry.
Okay. I think the last question so far, let's discuss the scenario when the U.S. does join the amendment, the Basel Amendment. What next and when?
Well, I'm not sure when, of course, but what would happen is that the U.S. government would then be obliged to implement and enforce it. And that would include the full prohibition that's now Article 4A, which is called the Basel Ban Amendment, as opposed to the Basel Plastics Amendments. And they would have to agree that. That's something they've always opposed. But now that it's part of the treaty, they would have to agree to it if they come into the treaty. And there's still probably some different agencies that will not want the U.S. to join Basel because of that agreement, although I think that's kind of a foolish attitude. The world has moved on, and maybe they lost that one, but it's now part of the treaty that you cannot export hazardous waste from the OECD to non-OECD countries. They would have to bite that one, but it would be terrific in terms of global governance. We'd have much more cooperation. We wouldn't have all this illegal traffic going on the high seas. The U.S. could be, a good faith broker at the meetings instead of just always trying to drag things down. They could be a willing, good faith participant in the Basel meetings. So we're all for it, especially now that the ban amendment is in the treaty and is in force, as are these plastic amendments.
Well, those were all the questions I see in the chat box. So if somebody would like to add another question, please go ahead and do it. Right now we've got about 10 minutes left. And honestly, I can't think of another question to ask you, Jim, because I think they've asked all the good ones.
Well, Well, here you can see how to reach me and BAN. And so if you have any of those questions, you can email them to info@ban.org. I'll get right on them, or you can give us a call. And I want to thank you, Heidi and gang, for this chance to present. This is a really important issue. It's coming weeks away, and everybody's fully unprepared to deal with it. So hopefully we're a little more prepared now.
We have people from all kinds of the state governments, and I know that they'll get the word out as soon as we're done here. That's what we were hoping for. So I guess I just want to thank you for all your many, many years of work. And I do want to ask you, how do you keep BAN funded? Because just so people know, I mean, this work is incredibly important. What you're doing, we need you to keep doing it. So how do you stay funded? I honestly don't know.
Well, two sources primarily. So we have philanthropic grants from philanthropic organizations. For example, we were able to do the GPS study on e-waste with using GPS trackers to follow e-waste with the Body Shop Foundation grant as an example. But we also have our eSteward certification program, and the recyclers pay fees to be part of that program, to be part of that gold standard on electronic waste. So those are our two primary sources. And this, of course, you can make a donation to us by coming to our website.
Great. Thank you so much for that great work. And I just, I always like to end with this, that leaders think and talk about the solutions, and followers think and talk about the problems. And I know everybody on this call is a leader, and we're all thinking about solutions, which is why the questions were directing the way they were. So I want to thank you all for being leaders. Thank you for caring. To me, the next generation is going to judge us very harshly if we do not get this stuff under control, and they should, because we're doing a terrible job as a society of protecting this planet from plastic waste. Next slide. And then just so you have our contact information as well. Follow us on YouTube, on social media. We'll help get the word out on things like this, but together we can all make this better. It's only going to take all of us working together to solve these problems. So my deepest gratitude to you, Jim, for what you do every day. And hopefully everybody can help us push this ball up a hill and get it over the hump and get us back into the world stage at the Basel Convention. So thanks again, everybody, and hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Thank
Bye,
you, Heidi.
Jen.
Thanks, everyone.
And happy Thanksgiving.